Good afternoon, everybody. It's time. The plan for today is to talk about the next group of plants, the Angiosperms. This is the flowers and fruit, just in time for our upcoming Valentine's Day. First, I'm going to start with some questions I had from students. I had some terrific questions from students, so I'd like to share those with you. One was generated by going through the gymnosperm life cycle, which is in front of you right now, figure 3118 from your textbook. And the student asked me, okay, having gone through this, do gymnosperms have alternation of generations? I'm confused. Well, think of, what is alternation of generations? Well, first of all, I should say the answer is absolutely. What is alternation of generations? It's having a life cycle where there's both a multicellular diploid stage. There's the multicellular diploid stage, right? The sporophyte is the multicellular diploid stage, and also having a multicellular haploid stage, and that's the gametophyte. So here we are, so called the pollen grains of the male gametophytes. So I think what's possibly confusing this student was that the gametophyte is such a tiny reduced state. After all, pollen is like powder. It's very, very small. They don't have very many cells, but it is multicellular. There's more than one cell. So the gametophytes, small though they are the multicellular stage. Where's the female gametophyte? Well, the female gametophyte is not easy to distinguish because it is also very small, also composed of a very small number of individual cells. But unlike the male gametophyte, which is at least released to the environment, the female gametophyte does not leave the sporophyte. It's retained in the sporophyte. So if we consider the female ovulate cone and the female cone and look at it in greater magnification, you can see the female gametophyte is just this tiny group of cells here that develops from the megaspore, which is just part of the ovule within a single scale of a female cone. So it's a little tiny structure embedded in the female cone. So it's not a separate obvious entity. So that's why it wasn't as clear that there is, in fact, alternation of generations. But absolutely, there is this alternation between multicellular diploid and haploid stages. It's just that the multicellular haploid stages are very tiny. And in the case of the female gametophyte, it's buried within other tissues, so it's not obvious from the outside. Another terrific question I had was from a student who was considering the issue of pollen release from a wind-pollinated gymnosperm, such as the evergreens that we have here on campus. And that student's question was, well, if the wind is just blowing the pollen around, then doesn't most of the pollen end up in the wrong place? I mean, how much of the pollen actually ends up on a female cone of the right species? So the answer to this question, doesn't most of the pollen end up in the wrong place? Absolutely. Only a tiny fraction of the pollen ever gets to the right location, meaning on the right part of the female cone, right? Because that's where the pollen has to end up, right? It has to actually end up in landing physically, blown by the wind on the appropriate structure of the same species. So yes, this doesn't seem like a terribly efficient way to reproduce. It obviously works, or we wouldn't have these trees still on the planet. And of course, if you consider what are the plant's options here, after all, the plant is rooted, right? If you consider what sporophyte life is like, the plant has roots, it's in the ground, it doesn't move, it is stuck in place. So it's completely dependent on a dispersal agent such as the wind to carry the pollen around, right? And wouldn't it be nice if the plant could actually harness the locomotory abilities of an animal? Get an animal, after all, animals can usually run around, right? Get an animal to actually take the pollen and move it around and transport it themselves. And of course, we do see this in what group? We see this in the angiosperms, because most angiosperms are not, in fact, wind pollinated, but rather they do have animal pollinators. animals that actually do function from the plant's point of view to transport pollen from one individual plant to another, or even within the same plant. So let's consider angiosperms then. This group of plants is characterized by fruits and flowers. And as we are discussing angiosperms, I hope one thing that's very clear to you is that angiosperms are absolute masters at manipulating the behavior of animals. This should not be interpreted as a statement of conscious intent, right? But rather that plants have attributes that influence the behavior of animals, and because such as their pollinating activities. And so any attributes of plants that do influence animals then, that increase the plant's fitness, would be acted upon by natural selection. Okay, so you should not assume the plants are aware of the spectacular colors of the flowers of their own species, right? They can't see, they don't have eyes. Can they detect or smell the floral scents that are given off, right? So, most of today then will be spent in discussing the manipulation of animals by plants. And we're not talking about a small group here. In fact, 90% of all the plant species on the planet at the moment are angiosperms. So if we consider our phylogeny, our phylogenetic tree of the different plant groups, in front of you is the highly simplified version of figure 31-9, which is the phylogenetic tree of the major groups, and hopefully this is by now extremely familiar to you. So fruits and flowers then are attributes shared by the lineage that is the flowering plants, the angiosperms, that bottom branch here on the phylogeny. And we already discussed that the seed plants as a whole, which includes the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, right? So this is the seed plants here. All have heterospory, right? Two different kinds of spores, the megaspores, the microspores. They have pollen, they have seeds. This is a shared characteristic of the seed plants. And we also know that we have a sporophyte-dominated life cycle because this is a characteristic shared of all of the vascular plants, right? Which includes all of these groups, right? The ferns and all the plants with seeds. Okay, so hopefully you're very comfortable now with understanding the relationship between these different groups in the highly simplified version of figure 31-9, avoiding some of the more the other side groups that are shown on the actual figure 31-9. Okay, so angiosperms are the dominant plants out there in the terrestrial landscape right now. Of course, this wasn't always the case. But one other important attribute of angiosperms is that almost all of our crops are also angiosperms. And you may be less familiar with thinking about food items in this respect, but let's go ahead and play Find the Angiosperm. Okay, we'll do this as a clicker question here. The answer counts, meaning you get more credit if you answer this correctly than if you don't. And you should pick the angiosperm in this list. Okay, if you're not quite sure, good time to chat with your neighbors and compare notes. There may be more than one correct answer. Okay, your choices are pork chop, rice, mushroom, bok choy, or soybean. What do you think? What's an angiosperm? Chat with your friends, and I'll check back in with you in 20 seconds. Okay, has everybody clicked in? Picked out an angiosperm? Alrighty, let's see. Let's see how you guys did here. All right. Well, none of you picked the pork chop. That's good. Sadly, some of you picked the mushroom. That is also an incorrect answer. 13 of you picked the mushroom. This is, in fact, an example of a fungus, which is really quite different. And we'll be chatting about fungi on Friday. And of course, this is a meat product, so this is animal in origin. And I know we haven't covered the animals yet either. But rice, absolutely, that's an angiosperm. Bok choy, soybeans, absolutely. All right, so virtually all of you picked the angiosperms. So when you go to the grocery store, if it's not a meat product, it is probably angiosperm in origin, because virtually everything is an angiosperm, as you'll see as we go through this. So, as mentioned, 90% of the species on the planet at the moment, the plant species are in fact angiosperms. So, this is a pretty recent development. How recent? Well, here we are, figure 28.7 from your textbook in front of you right now. Again, the Phanerozoic Eon. We're returning to that as our guidepost of thinking about the history of some of just a very small number of major evolutionary innovations that have shaped the life on the planet. And after the very first seed plants, which was the gymnosperms, about 200 million years went by before the angiosperms appeared on the planet. So that's really recent. In fact, here it is. The blue arrow right there shows the angiosperms. And so it's only in the last 100 million, 150 million years or so that angiosperms have been on the planet, and their domination is fairly recent. So if we compare this with what we learned about before, we learned about the very first land plants, so the non-vascular plants, things like mosses and so on. Those were the dominant plants on the very, very early terrestrial landscape, the period right after the Cambrian, right at the beginning of the Phanerozoic, right? So almost half a billion years ago. And then later on, then we had the large seedless vascular plants dominating in the Carboniferous, things like the giant ferns, right? Those sorts of plants now, major coal deposits everywhere on the planet. And then we, somewhat later, we had the appearance and diversification of the gymnosperms, which dominated thereafter. And now here we are in the age of the angiosperms. So on the terrestrial landscape then, there's been a gradual change in the type of plants that dominated the terrestrial landscape. And right now it is, in fact, the angiosperms. So, as mentioned before, angiosperms are perhaps best understood if one thinks about this in terms of their effects on animals, meaning animal behavior and their manipulation of animal behavior. One of my favorite books to recommend along these lines is the book Botany of Desire. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's a fascinating read. It's by Michael Pollan. Yes, his name is really Pollan. And there is a wonderful TED Talk that he's given. If you guys know about the TED Talks, if you go to the TED Talks and search for Michael Pollan, you'll pop up his, one of his talks. And so what this book details is the manipulation of humans specifically as opposed to manipulation of animals more generally. So picking a couple of crops and describing the amount of attention and money and energy that humans put into particular plants in terms of cultivation and fertilization and care and so on. I believe that's an apple on the cover, which is one example of a plant that we spend a lot of time on. And of course, how is our behavior manipulated? It's by the characteristics of the plant, such as the fruits and the flowers. Again, this is not conscious intent. So let's walk through the life cycle of an angiosperm then so we can understand these in the context of what we've learned about the other plants and consider more examples of how animal behavior is in fact manipulated. So this is figure 3119 from your book in front of you right now, which shows the life cycle of a typical angiosperm. And so knowing that this is a seed plant, hopefully you're all thinking, okay, we would expect, given that it's a land plant, you'd expect to see a sporophyte producing spores, a gametophyte, and then gametes, and then back to the sporophyte, right? So let's go ahead and walk through this. We're starting with our sporophyte on the left. This is the dominant life form. It's the diploid stage. This particular example of an angiosperm is a large, showy flower. And so, as I mentioned before, you are not responsible for all of the flower anatomical parts. This is in a document which I provide to you called Not Responsible For, whatever. It's available on the course website. But the plant then produces spores, two different kinds of spores, the microspore shown up here on the top line and the megaspore in the middle here. The microspore is going to lead to what? The male gametophyte. Again, just as we saw in the gymnosperms, the pollen grains, which also exist in angiosperms, are the male gametophytes. So they're tiny, there's not very many cells, but there's more than one, so it counts as a multicellular haploid stage. These disperse, but now it's no longer just the wind, although some angiosperms certainly do have pollen that is distributed by the wind, but many angiosperms also are dispersed by animals, specifically by animal pollinators that carry the pollen then to another flower. And obviously the probability of the pollen grains being transferred to the right location is significantly higher if it's being transported by an animal that is successively visiting many different flowers of the same or of the same species, in addition to the other flowers that are being visited by that particular individual. Okay, so that's the pollen being released. So in this particular flower then, I know students sometimes get a little bit confused about this. Here's the structure on the flower that is then releasing the pollen where it'll be picked up by an animal or the wind. Meanwhile, back in the ovary, so that's down here farther down in the structure of the flower, and it's shown in greater magnification here, there are a number of different structures. The individual parts of the ovary are called ovules. There's only one in here because it's a fairly simple diagram. And then that is where the megaspore exists, which then divides into what? The female gametophyte. Again, this is a very tiny structure, just a very small number of cells. And this is and it's retained within the flower. Okay, so it's not released to the outside. So that should remind you of what happened in the gymnosperms. And this is the structure that actually produces the egg. Should a pollen grain, a pollen particle, make it all the way to the flower, then it would be deposited here on this structure right here, which is shown again on the right-hand side of the diagram, but it's exactly the same structure. Okay. If a pollen grain lands on the appropriate location or is deposited there by an animal, by a pollinating animal, then, just as we saw in the gymnosperms, a pollen tube grows from that pollen grain. So that's this long structure here. And that is the tube through which the sperm travel on their way to the egg. But something very unusual happens in angiosperms. This is a peculiarity of angiosperms. You do not see this in other plant types. This is a phenomenon called double fertilization. It is called double fertilization because there are two sperm involved, even though only one is fertilizing an egg. So in double fertilization, you have one sperm fertilizing the egg. A second sperm fuses with a cell in the female gametophyte that has two haploid nuclei. So this separate event that is going on simultaneously then generates a triploid tissue. So this is separate from and in addition to the actual zygote. So notice that when we look at this particular part of the diagram, we have the zygote, which is the egg that was fertilized by one of the sperms, and then right next to it is this structure, which is this peculiar triploid tissue, which has two haploid nuclei from the female gametophyte, and then one additional haploid nucleus from the second sperm, which was the second fertilization event, although this tissue, which has a special name, the endosperm, is not going to turn into a plant. It is just basically baby food. What I mean by that, it's packaged within the seed. So if we now look at the seed, here's an example of a seed over here. You see the developing embryo, which is the diploid individual, which will eventually grow up into a sporophyte if that seed is planted in an appropriate location and watered and so on. But the rest of the seed is packed with this tissue that supplies nutrients to the developing embryo. This is the same thing as this triploid endosperm. So these are exactly the same thing, which is called nutritive tissue over on the left, and endosperm on the right. It's the same triploid tissue. This ovary, this structure down at the bottom of the flower, is what then develops into the fruit itself. So the fruit surrounds the seeds. The seed, or seeds, depending on the kind of fruit, is then part of this overall larger structure, which is the fruit. This picture does not capture the rather extraordinary structures of pollen, and so I thought I would at least show you an attractive scanning electron microscope picture of pollen. This is actually from the National Geographic Pollen Photo Gallery. And so what you're looking at here is the surface of a part of the tissue of a plant, the location where pollen is deposited by a visitor. And you are looking at a number of different kinds of pollen. Even if you're not a pollen expert, you can probably tell that you have different species here. This pollen over here on the left, which is very pointy, is from a different species than this one right here, which has sort of a groove down it. This is another completely different kind of species. This is another one over here. So clearly, whatever deposited these pollen grains on this particular plant had maybe gone and visited a number of different flowers and had picked up pollen from a number of different locations. We can actually see the pollen grain that is the correct species. It is this one here. Why do you know? Because it is in fact developing a pollen tube. You can see this structure here. So there's the pollen grain. There's the pollen tube then heading on its way towards the egg. So that, if we go back to this other picture here, here's where we were looking in the scanning electron micrograph. So it's the same as this location right here, this location on the flower. And then the pollen tube will grow all the way down and have to reach the egg for the sperm to be able to locomote in the correct direction here. Okay. So we've been looking at flashy, attractive, colorful flowers and fruits, but not all angiosperms have that kind of appearance, and it in fact relates very closely to the manipulation or lack of manipulation of the animals that are a very important part of the life cycle in the plants. So grasses, for example, are also angiosperms. Many grasses are in fact wind pollinated, and so they tend to be less flashy because, in terms of colors or odors, because they're not attracting animal pollinators. So wheat is in fact a kind of grass, and if you look at wheat, then you do not see the kind of colors and scents that attract vertebrate vertebrate or invertebrate animals, animal pollinators. So if we actually take a wheat seed and look at the structure, then we can connect this back to the life cycle diagram that we were just looking at. So I pulled information on wheat from Wikipedia. There's a nice diagram here. You may or may not know the difference between flour that is made from grinding whole wheat flour versus white flour, both of which are made from grinding up wheat. This is a diagram of a seed right here, and notice the different parts. Slightly different terms are used. We've got the something labeled germ here. This just simply means the embryo, so this is the developing sporophyte, right? And it's packaged here in a seed. The outer part is referred to as the bran. And here in the middle is the endosperm, that triploid tissue, which is the result of that second fertilization event where the second sperm fertilized that one cell in the female gametophyte. Whole wheat flour then is what one gets if one grinds up all of the parts of the seed, and the white flour is just the endosperm, and it has much less fiber and protein than whole wheat flour because it contains different parts of the overall seed. Okay, so the fruit develops from the ovary. I think it's a little hard to follow in this particular diagram, so I found an animation for you that I think makes this whole where is the fruit coming from a little bit more obvious. So let me play this animation. It's only about 30 seconds long or so. So what you're looking at here is a YouTube video where you're looking at a flower here in cutaway view. So you're sort of peering into the ovary here. Normally it wouldn't look like this, it would be closed. You could tell this is a flower because we have some petals right here, and then you can see the other plant parts. Let's go ahead and start up this movie. And I've gotten rid of the audio here so we can just watch what's happening. So of course it wouldn't happen this rapidly. So after pollen is in fact deposited and the sperm travel down and fertilize the egg, we've got development of seeds, then the rest of the flower, the petals and so on, are released and wither away here, and you see a change. So this was the ovary. The ovary as a whole develops into the fruit, and the seeds from the individual ovules. And so, of course, this is again in cutaway view. This is just so that you can see the inside of the fruit. This is supposed to represent an apple. And so the fruit is then surrounding the individual seeds. And so the endosperm and so on is tucked inside these individual seeds, and the number of seeds that you end up with depends on how many successful sperm reached how many eggs within the different ovules and how many ovules there were and so on. So what is the purpose of this fruit from the plant's point of view? Well, an animal coming along and eating the fruit then will swallow the seeds, the animal will walk off, and then will defecate the seeds out at some time later. Seeds can pass through a lot of herbivore digestive tracts perfectly fine, and so this is a way of dispersing seeds, and so the fruit is a way of attracting animals then that will consume the fruit and help disperse the seeds. So that is the purpose, the functional significance of the fruit then from the point of view of the plant. So this is yet, this is what I mean by manipulation of animals then. One can tell a lot about the animals that the plant is interacting with from its characteristics. So one of the fascinating examples, an unusual kind of plant, is this one shown in this particular picture here, which is the so-called corpse flower. It's also called the Titanarum. That is the common name, although it's not really that common because there are very few specimens. They're native to Indonesia. You could tell how large this one is by looking at this human being standing next to the flower. So they're huge flowers. And they are called the corpse flower because when they, on the rare occasions when this extraordinary, gigantic flower actually does bloom, it smells like a rotting corpse, okay? So it has a very unpleasant stench from the point of view of a human, but it's attractive to the potential pollinators. And what kind of animal is attracted to the smell of dead bodies? Well, things like carrion flies, which are flies that are attracted to rotting corpses and lay maggots lay eggs in the flesh, and this is where the maggots develop and so on. So these flowers are rather extraordinary. Let's go ahead and watch a little time-lapse movie because it takes a very long time. You can see it's dark and light and dark and light. You can see all these people holding their noses because it smells so disgusting. But it's really a spectacular show. And although they're native to Indonesia, and there are very few representatives here in North America, there is actually one at the nearby Huntington Botanic Garden. And so if we have a quick field trip here and go visit the website of the Huntington Botanic Garden, then we can see and read about the most recent blooming, which was in August of 2014. This was the 5th bloom at the Huntington Botanic Garden. The first one was in 1999, then there was another one in 2002, 2009, 2010. So when this blooms and sends out this revolting stench of dead bodies, and then the flies come in, what are the chances that this individual plant will actually be pollinated? What are the chances that any of those flies that are arriving will actually be carrying pollen from visiting another one of these plants? Well, pretty close to zero, right? How many of these plants are there? So from the point of view of growing this plant and propagating this plant, then this individual sporophyte may flower repeatedly, but what about getting seeds? You need to have some pollen coming in in order, because this is actually not a self-pollinating plant. So you have to have some pollen coming in if you want to get seeds and then plant those to get more individual plants like this. Well, in fact, they were able to pollinate it, that is the staff members, the humans who work at the Botanic Gardens, because they were able to use pollen from a recent bloom at Orange Coast College, where apparently there is also an individual plant, but they had to, the humans had to actually do this. So if you look at this flower, where does the pollen have to end up? Well, in the ovaries, right down here. So if you actually scroll down and look at the pictures, here is a person who's cut away a little window here and is actually by hand putting pollen in there that was collected from this other individual plant. There's a slightly closer view, and so they're hoping to get seeds. Apparently they still don't know if they in fact will be getting seeds from this or not, but they're hoping they will. So that is not the only plant that smells like dead bodies. Here, there is actually a picture in your textbook of what carrion flowers, so-called carrion flowers look like, and so they even sort of look a little bit like rotting flesh, and they also smell like rotting flesh. So you can see a fly in there that's been attracted by the odor. Again, these are common. So if you're around a flower that smells like this, you can guess the pollinator because you know the characteristics that are attractive to the animals. Those are the animals that are being brought in this particular case, flies that are attracted to dead, rotting corpses. Here's an example of a plant with different attributes. This is also a picture from your textbook. Flowers like this that are bright red and have elongate tubular structures like this are typically very attractive to hummingbirds. As this bird is sticking its beak into this flower and taking some of the nectar from the base of the flower here, notice here are the structures that are depositing pollen then on the bird's face here. And so as the bird goes from flower to flower to flower, then it is carrying its pollen-covered face with it and potentially pollinating then other flowers that it is visiting. But this is something that's very attractive to hummingbirds, and therefore plants that have these attributes then are able to harness the flying power of hummingbirds to distribute then the pollen. Many of the flowers that are pollinated by bees are bright purple, and this is a characteristic of bumblebee pollinated flowers. This is a picture of a bumblebee that's completely covered with pollen. That's what all these little white specks are as it crawls around on these flowers, gets pollen all over its body, and then as it goes, it is spreading pollen then to receptive flowers in its environment. Now, so as you consider the characteristics of a plant that may or may not be attractive to different kinds of animals, of course you have to take the sensory capabilities of those animals into consideration, because not all animals have identical sensory capabilities, whether it's detection of chemical compounds or smells or visual stimuli. So, for example, bees see a bit into the ultraviolet compared to us. So when we look at a bee, or when we look at a flower, we see something that looks more what you see on the left. Right, you've probably learned about the electromagnetic radiation in intro physics, right? And you learned that there's a small section of the overall spectrum, which is what we refer to as visible light, right? And the longer wavelengths are red, and that goes to orange, yellow, and so on, up through purple. And wavelengths that are either shorter or longer than wavelengths of light in that one little spectrum that we're capable of detecting then are invisible to us. But bees see a bit more into the shorter wavelengths, so they can see some of the ultraviolet radiation that we're unaware of. And so there are very common patterns that a bee can actually see. So so evolutionary biologists who are interested in studying behavioral responses of insects, such as bees, to flower patterns, then have to be looking at them in the right spectrum. So there are a lot of interesting websites. Let's go have a quick peek at this particular website, which shows some examples of flowers in the light or the ultraviolet. There's actually a fairly long list here. We'll just have a quick peek at the first one here. This is the familiar daffodil, so you're used to this. When we look at this in visible light, then we see something that looks sort of uniformly monochromatic in yellow, and here's the kind of pattern that is visible in UV to an individual that is actually capable of seeing into the UV, such as many insects, including many bees. So, honeybees are really important pollinators as well. There are a lot of different kinds of bees. This is a picture of a honeybee that's completely covered with pollen here as well. So each one of those little yellow globs is a male gametophyte. Right? And honeybees, of course, as pollinators, have been in the news a lot recently because of a rather frightening phenomenon that has occurred in the last 10 years or so, which has been dubbed the so-called colony collapse disorder, which is when beekeepers report that they have hives where the bees have just pretty much disappeared. Sometimes the queen and some of the immatures are left, but the bees are just gone. And this happened in rather large frightening numbers in many of the years in the past decade or so. And so a number of scientists have been working on this, trying to understand the causes. The last year or two has actually been a little bit better. And so scientists are hoping that we're sort of out of the woods a little bit here, but it has been very alarming. Why is this so alarming? Well, because of our dependence on honeybee pollinators for many of the agricultural crops that we care about. I don't think we have time actually to visit some of the sites, but if the USDA site, the United States Department of Agriculture, has a very nice website on colony collapse disorder with a lot of information on it, and there's a lot of nice news reports, but I pulled this particular graphic from one of these news reports, which shows an example of just some of the crops in our country that are very heavily dependent on honeybee pollination specifically. And so what these crops in this list are soybeans, alfalfa, cotton, almonds, apples, oranges, peaches, cherries, grapefruit, tangerines. And again, this is just a partial list. And over here on the right is the percentage of those crops that is completely dependent on honeybee pollination specifically. So you can see soybeans, 50%, alfalfa, 60%, cotton, 80%, almonds, 100%. And if you think about if you actually eat almonds, what is it that you're eating? You're eating the seeds, right? And the seeds will only be produced if what happens, if pollen is then transferred such that a seed can actually form, the sperm has to reach the egg, and so on. These are all angiosperms, okay? And the rest of the things on this list are 90, 80, 90% dependent on honeybee pollination per se. And so if when the honeybees are in decline, then this means that the pollination services provided by these important creatures are also in decline. So this is a huge worry in agricultural circles. It's important to all of us. So while we're talking about agriculture, of course, most crop plants, as mentioned before, are in fact angiosperms, and current agricultural practices do tend to lead to extremely low genetic diversity in the crop plants in our fields. So you might think, well, why is this, and why is it that current agricultural practices are in this way? Well, it's certainly easier to harvest a crop if the only species in the field is in fact the one that you're harvesting. So this leads then to monoculture, the cultivation of just a single type at a time. So you'll have a large field with just one dominant species in it, which is, of course, is very different from more natural biological settings in the wild. And in addition, many crop plants are specifically chosen or the seeds are chosen to be more similar to each other, because after all, if you're harvesting, it's more convenient if your crop plants are all maturing at about the same time and are all about the same height and so on. It's much easier and more efficient to harvest the more similar it is. But if you, in fact, do have more similar crops, the less the genetic diversity, then there are a couple of problems. And one is that if your crops are extremely genetically homogeneous and invariant, then you don't have the genetic diversity to improve the strains further. No longer can you pick individuals that exemplify particular traits that one is interested in selecting for in artificial selection regimes. But another problem is that susceptibility to disease is then a huge issue, because if you have a uniform crop, if one individual in that field is susceptible to a particular disease or a particular pest, then if that pest or the disease moves through, then all of the individuals that share that susceptible characteristic then are also equally susceptible. One of the extreme examples is what's going on with bananas at the moment. So let's talk about bananas. And bananas are also interesting because they're an interesting example of a seedless fruit. So talking about the catastrophe that is affecting the banana cultivation at the present time internationally, and then also gives us a chance to talk about seedless fruits. So let's go ahead and visit the Wikipedia entry on seedless fruits. It's actually fairly informative, and so we'll use that as our visual backdrop here. Let me move this out of the way here. So what is a seedless fruit? A seedless fruit is a fruit that is developed and produces no mature seeds. Okay, and that should be maybe a little self-evident, but why is it that such a thing even exists? Well, of course, it should not surprise you. This is consumer-driven, right? That's the second sentence here. As consumption of seedless fruits is generally easier and more convenient for a human consumer, then they are considered commercially valuable. And so in our grocery stores, for example, you can see many examples of seedless fruits, such as the picture of the watermelon right here in this. Most commercially produced seedless fruits have been developed from plants whose fruits normally contain numerous, relatively large, hard seeds distributed through the flesh of the fruit. And this should make biological sense to you. After all, we've just been discussing how the fruit forms around the seeds, and so that's why normally the fruit does in fact enclose seeds. I like this sentence, and hopefully this makes sense to all of you too. The term seedless fruit is biologically somewhat contradictory, since fruits are usually defined in a botanical sense as mature ovaries containing seeds. Right, so how on earth can one even produce seedless fruits in the first place? There are a number of different ways in which seedless fruits can be developed or can occur. Let's look at this example right here. Seedless bananas and watermelon fruits are produced on triploid plants whose 3 sets of chromosomes prevent meiosis from taking place, and thus the plants cannot produce fertile gametes. And so they're going ahead and producing fruit, but they're not producing seeds because there is no possibility for successful fertilization going on here with the sperm and the egg, because they're triploid. And so what that means then is a plant like this, if this did arise sort of naturally in the wild, it would just die without producing any offspring, right? Because it's incapable of producing seeds. So how is it then that we have any of these plants? Well, lacking seeds and therefore the capacity to propagate via the fruit, the plants are generally propagated vegetatively by cuttings. So if any of you were gardeners, you might be familiar with this concept where you take a plant, many plants are like this, and you can lop a bit off and then stick it in some water under the right conditions. Then that piece of the plant will develop roots, and you can go ahead and plant it, and you have a second individual that you generated from the first individual from which you took this cutting. This is considered vegetative propagation because it does not involve sexual reproduction. Okay? But of course, when you do this, you've produced a second individual that is genetically identical to the first individual. So in fact, seedless fruits that are developed in such a way like this then are all clones, right? So, let's see if we continue. In such cases, resulting plants are genetically identical clones. blah, 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 fruit, okay, let's see. Let's go ahead and scroll down here. All right, one disadvantage, let's look at this last paragraph. One disadvantage of most seedless crops is a significant reduction in the amount of genetic diversity in the species. As genetically identical clones, a pest or disease that affects one individual is likely to be capable of affecting every clone of that individual. For example, the vast majority of commercially produced bananas are cloned from a single source, the Cavendish cultivar. These plants are currently threatened worldwide by a newly discovered fungal disease to which they are highly susceptible. So that is the current global banana crisis going on right now, and this is a picture of the so-called Cavendish cultivar right here. This is only one type of banana that is commonly sold in grocery stores, but it is the most common one. I've got some banana fun facts for you here. Let's see. Let's see. Americans eat more bananas than any other kind of fresh fruit. On average, 26.2 pounds per person. Apples come in second. Okay? So, a fungal disease is spreading globally. It is continuing to spread, and so it is quite possible that this cultivar, we have a few more minutes, and I also have a clicker question coming up, so you might want to quit rustling, okay? All right. All the bananas worldwide that look like this is the Cavendish cultivar. They have no seeds. They're vegetatively propagated. They're all clones. They're all susceptible to this fungal disease, which we'll talk about a little bit more on Friday. But first, before we break, let's then consider this clicker question. This is one that you should be able to answer. I've gone ahead and coded this as all responses count. This is an example of a former test question. Consider a tetraploid angiosperm, meaning tetraploid in its dominant stage. What would the ploidy level of the gametophyte be? What do you think? N, 2N, 3N, 4N? What do you think? If you're not sure, why don't you check with your neighbors, and I'll give you 30 seconds or so, and then I'll check in with you, and I'll discuss the answer.
Quick point. If you want to tell them that the bees covered in pollen, that's because when they fly, they lose electrons and gain a negative and a positive charge.
Oh.
The flowers are very charged.
I don't have time to go into that. And I also think, I mean, their grasp of electrostatic stuff is sufficient. I think it would.
Just a fun fact.
No, it's a very fun fact.
That
Yeah.
they just kind of like suck
Right.
up the pollen.
Yeah,
They
no,
don't
that's kind of
actually
cool.
collect that.
I think there's actually some problems with some of that, but anyway. Yeah. Okay, everybody clicked in? Alrighty. Let's see what you guys think here. Hey, about half of you got this right. Okay, so what would you need to know and pull together in order to get this right? This is an example. This is an example of maybe a synthetic or conceptual question where we haven't covered this exact point, right? But you should have the pieces of information in order to make an informed guess, right? So, to answer this question, you have to figure out, well, what's the dominant stage, right? And in an angiosperm, you should know this is the sporophyte, right? And you also know that in angiosperms, typically the gametophyte has half as many chromosome copies as the sporophyte, right? So it's usually N versus 2N. It can also be 2N versus 4N, 3N versus 6N, and so on. That's what the pattern that one gets in polyploid angiosperms. You also would have to know what tetraploid means, right? And you've actually seen this word in a couple of different contexts. Tetra means 4, right? So you would also have to know what that actually means. Okay, so those are the pieces of information you need to pull together. I'll see you on Friday or possibly tomorrow at office hours.